And so dyslexia is a paradox. And I think that's sometimes what gives people trouble. It's not just a problem, and it's just not having all these strengths. It's both. And in 1996, I was asked to write this article by Scientific American to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Dr. Morgan's first description. And we developed this cartoon strip called The Paradox of Dyslexia. So in the first frame, you see Amy, she's dyslexic, and she's trying to read the word volcano, and she goes, v, I can't do it. All right, then show her a picture. So here's Amy looking at a picture of a volcano, and she goes, it's, but there are those word retrieval difficulties. What comes out of her mouth? Not volcano, but tornado. They sound alike. And her teacher, observing that Amy can't read it or say the word easily, says, Amy, don't you know what a volcano is? Amy, hearing the word, says, oh, a volcano, it's a big mountain with a hole on top, et cetera, et cetera. Of course she knows what it is, but if you depend on her ability to quickly read the word or rapidly retrieve it, you'll get the wrong idea that she doesn't know what it is. So in the diagnosis of dyslexia, it's a clinical diagnosis. That means we base it on knowing the person. We ask about spoken language difficulties, trouble learning letters, their letter sounds, sounding out words. And one of the things that I've learned is speaking to some of the most successful adults who happen to be dyslexic, and I ask them, what was school like for you? And their face will drop and they'll say, oh my goodness, I remember the horror of being called on to read aloud. That's the time the kids become silly or roll under the table or have to go to the bathroom or spend the time figuring, okay, let's see, I'm gonna have to read this sentence and practice it. But you know, sometimes children and even teachers aren't kind. So you hear the tittering or, Johnny, why can't you read that? So when you're reading quietly to yourself, no one knows if you're reading, what you're reading, but when you have to read aloud, you're naked in front of everybody, and that's really difficult. The other is being a slow reader. Sometimes people say to me, well, I'm not dyslexic, I'm just a slow reader. Duh. Bennett explained this word form area that integrates the phonology, the orthography, and the semantics. Why would an otherwise intelligent person be a slow reader? They have difficulty getting to the sounds of words, and the connections are not working efficiently. So that's another important symptom. Another one is difficulties with spelling. I don't think I've met a dyslexic, I probably have met one, but far more common is to have difficulties in spelling and coding. Poor handwriting, we spoke about that earlier. But the same child who has difficulties with handwriting can really learn keyboarding and can do so early. And attention, this is really important. We as human beings have available to us a bucket of attention, okay? A limited amount. If you're an fluent automatic reader, you don't need to go into that bucket much. It just happens. It's wonderful. If you're dyslexic, reading isn't automatic, it's manual. And you have to keep getting refills from that bucket of attention because you're working so hard. So what happens is reading is tiring because you're really working at it. And you're very vulnerable to distraction. You have to garner all the attention you can to focus on what you're doing. And I'm so proud of people like the young man over here and like you, David, who put in that effort. And a wonderful tutor here said, make sure people understand that it's not an instant thing that people learn. It takes a while, and it's huge amount of effort. We had a conference a couple of years ago for educators, and we had a panel of dyslexic students. And after the conference, the educators told me, I had no idea how hard they were working, how much effort and energy they were putting in and how much it took out of them. Often when people come to our center for evaluation or studies, I'll speak to them the next day or so. They'll say, I went to sleep as soon as I got home, because having people who need to use that attention, it's exhausting. At the same time, there's also what we call a comorbidity. Many people who are dyslexic have attention deficit hyperactivity. That's a little different than the attention that's used up when reading. Difficulties with a foreign language, and I would be remiss if I didn't share with you that about 15, 20 years ago, I spoke to the top executive administrators at Yale and made a suggestion. Could we give a partial waiver of the foreign language requirement to students at Yale? And they agreed, because I explained the reason. And then I had to go meet with the foreign language department. I'm small, but I shrunk much more when speaking to them. They were not happy, but they were good citizens, and they went along. And now, 15 to 20 years later, they will email me or call me and say, Dr. Shaywitz, I have this lovely young man. He's tried so hard. I've met with him. He's met with a tutor, and he's never going to master this. And it's pulling away his energy and time from courses that he could master and really gain something from. So this is what we do at Yale, and I always mention it because I don't think I've noticed that Yale has fallen from the academic ladder, even though we offer foreign language accommodation. We offer a full range of accommodations. And at Yale, we have, probably a couple of hundred students in our undergraduate, graduate, professional schools who are dyslexic, and they're not special students, they're just regular students. But we have a policy that is smart and understands dyslexia and supports students who are dyslexic. And the thing we're concerned about so much is, what does it do to you when you're smart and you understand and you can't read or you can't utter the word quickly? What it does to self-esteem and the growing anxiety. And the earlier we intervene, the more we can prevent that, which is what leaves the lasting damage. And so as kids get older, the weakness is still in getting to the sounds of spoken words, but we see slow reading, but still surrounded by a sea of strengths. I found that I've met so many people who are dyslexic, no matter where I go, and yet often people don't fully understand what it is. So I've developed this card that I'm going to share with you. It's a copywritten card that tells what the weakness is, but also paired with the strength. So you may be dyslexic if you read slowly and with much effort, are often the one to solve the problem. Can't spell, have messy handwriting, but your writing shows terrific imagination. Have trouble remembering dates and names, but think out of the box and grasp the big picture. Have difficulty retrieving and pronouncing spoken words, but have an excellent vocabulary and idea. So this is the entity. It has weaknesses and it has strengths. So dyslexia is a clinical diagnosis, and I've shared with you, and in my book I write about it, what do you look for? It's not a number on a page. It's the person, understanding the person. You want to ask questions that reflect what we know. So you ask about the history. You want to observe the person speaking and reading. And you look for that disparity between reading and intelligence, education, or professional status. And it's really important to not only assess how accurately a person reads, but how fluently. And several years ago, there was a legal case brought by a woman named Marilyn Bartlett, who was seeking extra time on, I think it was the law boards. And she eventually won the case, but Judge Sonia Sotomayor, who is now in the Supreme Court, was then, I believe, a circuit judge in New York. And she very wisely determined that by its very nature, diagnosing a learning disability requires clinical judgment, that it's not quantifiable merely by test scores. So here's, in terms of management, because that's why we're here, what can we do about it? The bad news, let me share the bad news with you. As a physician, we often share bad news. Children who are behind early on and do not catch up by grade 3 remain behind. But there's good news. In teaching reading, we now have the scientific and practical know-how to prevent reading failure. So it's all about prevention. Now the question is, do we have the will? I see more and more manifestations of that will. Your neighbors are having the will. You have to have that will. So in terms of teaching reading, what do you teach? How do you know what to teach? You look to the evidence. You know, as a physician, this patient comes to me with a problem, and they'll say, what should I do? I'll think about the evidence, the scientific papers that have been published comparing one treatment to another, hopefully through a randomized clinical trial, and I'll pick the one that was most effective. But what has amazed me in 2012, that's not being done in education as much as it needs to be. Oh, I like that program. Or it has a pretty cover. Or the publisher said, oh, this will work. You want to be people who say, where's the evidence? Where is the scientific evidence? And Congress, it's interesting we're here now because Congress has played a major role in providing the evidence. In 1998, Congress was very concerned there seemed to be an epidemic of reading difficulties. So Congress mandated that a national reading panel be established to investigate what methods and approach are most effective in teaching reading. I was honored to be part of the small group that constituted the National Reading Panel and actually presented the data to Congress in April, I think, of 2000. And it's always good to read the small print, and this print actually was written by Bennett. Right here on the bottom, what the National Reading Panel, an evidence-based assessment of the scientific research literature on reading and its implications for reading instruction. So when we think of what makes a difference, what counts, what we've learned is that children have to be taught 5 elements of reading: alphabetics, phonemic awareness skills. That gets back to what we've been talking about, getting to the sounds of spoken words, being able to pull them apart, being able to move them around, and also being able to learn how the sounds connect to letters. That's phonics, and this has to be taught in a systematic and explicit way. Reading fluency, the ability to read not only accurately but automatically, vocabulary, and understanding what you're reading. And I'm going to just take a moment to talk about fluency, which is the ability to read accurately, rapidly, and with good intonation. As we spoke about a few minutes ago, we each have a limited reserve of attention. So if you're reading fluently, it's effortless. You know how your lungs go in and out? You don't have to tell them, and it's not tiring, thankfully. That's what happens when your child or an adult is a fluent reader. And the implication is that we have to identify children early to help ensure that they become fluent readers. Even at a very early age, we can look at risk factors, knowing about the history, and how do they get to the sounds of spoken language before reading, but there are tests that you can assess that, and you can contain that history. It can and it must be measured. You can't only measure the accuracy of reading, you have to measure the fluency. And first, you want to make sure children receive systematic and explicit instruction in phonemic awareness and phonics, but then that they have the practice in oral reading with feedback and guidance. And fluency is a lifelong issue. Accuracy may improve, but fluency, you can close the gap a little, but it's very rare for a child or adult who's dyslexic to be a fluent reader. It persists. And here's a child who is in kindergarten, and she came home the other day to tell her parents, I got it. And she went and grabbed Go Dog Go and said, I can read this. And it was such a wonderful moment. And here's another child who is a fluent reader, who learned how to read and read well. And I know this child, and I know she likes noodles. And you can see here, here's her dinner of noodles, but she's ignoring that because she loves to read. So she's glued to that page. And when you see a fluent reader, as I have, as so many of you have, you realize what worlds open up to that child. Being able to read, you know, it's not only books, it's signs, it's instructions. We have such a print-based society. And the magic it opens up. At the same time, the denial that happens to so many children, indeed needlessly, when they're not taught appropriately. So what makes a difference? We talked about phonemic awareness and phonics and fluency and vocabulary and comprehension. What about class size? We reviewed the evidence recently for class size, and let me share with you what the evidence is. Smaller classes in early grades, K-3, boost student academic achievement. Classes of no more than 18 students are per teacher are required to produce the greatest results. And this is very, very important. Minority and low-income students show the greater gains when they're placed in small classes in the primary grades. And what's so interesting, even when kids go on to middle and high school and in bigger classes, the children who were in the smaller classes, their gains persist. It's a no-brainer. It should be a no-brainer because small instructional groups within the classroom allows the teacher to group the kids and to provide explicit instruction in children who need the same thing to practice similar skills. To go into a classroom where it's a small class size and the teacher is able to group children and work with a small group of children on the same needs is incredible, whereas if you see a large group, where's the teacher to begin? It's unfair to the teacher, it's unfair to the children, and it's a waste of money. Because the teacher is being paid, and there's not, the result is going to cost the school and our society a lot more in the end. What about teacher knowledge? The experience and preparation of teachers is a critical factor in the success or failure of class size reduction programs. Reducing class size will have little effect unless you have well-qualified teachers. And we've been in those classrooms. It's not just giving an evidence-based program. You have to know what to do with it. And you have to have the toolbox to say, oh, this child needs this, but that child needs that. We are being unfair to our teachers not to prepare them in a serious scientific way. You know, we're sending rockets to the moon and Mars, and we're putting teachers in classrooms who don't know how to teach reading. This is a shame, and we have to do something about it. And supports such as professional development for teachers and a rigorous curriculum enhance the effect of reduced class size and academic achievement. So professional development also has to become serious. I've seen professional development that's not really serious or scientifically based. So in terms of effective reading intervention, prevention, early intervention, before any harm is done, evidence-based methods, knowledgeable, flexible, and caring teachers. Great teachers can make a huge difference. But if you have teachers, no matter how caring and how intelligent, if they don't have the knowledge and the practice to do it the way it needs to be done, it's really so unfair. And instruction, and that's why you need class sizes. You can have the small groups. Intense means very small groups. And sufficient duration. 20 minutes once a week is not going to do it. Now I want to talk about accommodations, because we do have dyslexic students who have gone through school, who have received good instruction, and put in an incredible amount of effort and perseverance over many years. These are individuals, these are students who are very intelligent, but they read slowly, and they're the 24/7 people. Often, and I've heard it again and again, the school doesn't see what the child has put in to be able to do well. Oh, I have a headache. I can't go to the movies with my friends tonight because I'm going to stay home and study. Or I'm not going to go to the football game on Sunday because I'm studying. But it pays off. And then they want to go to college or graduate school or professional school. And what do you need to do? You need to take a high-stakes standardized test. So what accommodations are, they're critical for ensuring that the test measures ability rather than disability. It's necessary to level the playing field, but it's often misunderstood. And in the next video clip, you're going to see.
I think the one thing that really annoys me is when people say, he's so smart, he's doing better than other kids. Like challenging the idea that he's dyslexic. If he's doing B+, but he can do an A+, then he should be supported so that he can do the A+, because that's within his capacity. People struggle with that notion because they think he's getting a leg up, whereas it's actually evening the playing field.
So accommodations, you're not giving people answers. By themselves, they don't produce success. It's the catalyst that allows success to happen. Basically, dyslexia robs a person of time, accommodations return it. And what's so exciting now is we actually have neurobiologic evidence for the need for extra time. So as Bennett explained, here is a typical reader, the three systems on the left side. If you're dyslexic, this word form area works inefficiently. So you may develop and use regions in the front of the brain, on the right side, and what's called the homologue of the word form area on the right side. What that allows you to do is read more accurately, but not automatically. And the way I see it is, if you're a typical reader and you see a word, you're on the express highway to reading. What's the big deal? If you're dyslexic, that express highway is blocked. So what do? You can't take the express highway, you get off, and you take a secondary, a country road. And you know about country roads, they're bumpier, they're more circuitous. You'll get there, but you have to work a lot harder, and it'll take a lot longer. And even with extra time, the person is going to feel rushed. And similarly for oral exams, because of the word retrieval difficulties and anxiety, oral exams may not allow the demonstration of the knowledge and skills, especially in an artificial anxiety-provoking setting. So there's a great need, an imperative to minimize the factors exacerbating anxiety during an oral exam. We need support, and we need to do whatever we can to minimize the level of anxiety, and also to make sure that people understand that the person may know it, and this may not be an accurate reflection of their knowledge. So the practical consequences is dyslexic speakers have word retrieval difficulties, and they're particularly penalized by oral exams when put on the spot. This interacts with anxiety. Dyslexic readers need more time to read, and young dyslexic adults, access to college, graduate, or professional schools is often determined by high-stakes exam. I don't think I've seen a child whose parents' most important question hasn't been, what will become of my child? And we've studied, and others have studied, adults who have a childhood history of reading disability. The phonologic difficulty persists, without question. The speaking difficulties and word retrieval persist, especially when put on the spot. You can learn to read with a high degree of accuracy, but not automaticity. You'll be a slow reader. The anxiety increases and interacts with the dyslexia. A few years ago, I published a book called Overcoming Dyslexia. It took 5 years to write. My husband will tell you they were very long years. And I thought that I had finished, and we were lecturing at a college in Massachusetts, and one of the professors there said to me, well, Dr. Shaywitz, what do you think about those people who are dyslexic? Obviously didn't know me. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? They said, well, you know, they want to be teachers and doctors and lawyers now. Can you imagine a person like that? I could. And so I knew I had to add a section to my book. I called it the epilogue, and it was entitled A Person Like That. And in it, I wanted to write about people like that who were dyslexic and who could do things that were counterintuitive. You wouldn't think a dyslexic person could do. I wanted teachers who saw that struggling reader in their class to know this was possible. I wanted parents to know it, and I wanted the people themselves to know it. So the first person I wrote about was John Irving, the writer, who talks about how difficult reading is for him. And so what about the outcome? People with dyslexia are often very high-level conceptualizers, often referred to as out-of-the-box thinkers, and they're capable of very high accomplishment, and often they're the people who are the leaders in a range of disciplines: science, medicine, law, business, writing, literature, poetry. And I think a disproportionately high number of dyslexics have been leaders in medicine and science, because you can't imagine the people that call me and come to see me, and they all have the secret, and they think they're the only one. And yet, I'll just give you one example. Somebody I wrote about in my book who was a cardiac surgeon who came to see me, and I could see he was just feeling so terrible. And he's a man in his 60s who was dyslexic, and he was ready to leave, and I couldn't let him go feeling like that. And I said, well, do you know who else is dyslexic? And he said, who? And I said, Dr. Toby Cosgrove, who's a very preeminent cardiac surgeon and CEO of the Cleveland Clinic. He said, go on now. I said, no, really. He said, but I said, why? What's the problem? He said, well, it couldn't be. And I said, why? And he said, because he's so smart. I said, that's the irony, so are you. And the idea that if you're a slow reader, you couldn't be a smart thinker. Oh, but often educators, or sometimes parents or people, don't know, and they don't encourage people to go forward. So here is Dr. Tyler Lucas, and he's talking about what happened when he told his 8th grade advisor, a social studies teacher, I think, that he wanted to be a doctor.
Social studies teacher asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I told him that I wanted to become a doctor. And I remember him sort of laughing under his breath and saying, well, I just don't see you as doing that, Tyler. That requires a lot of reading, and I don't think medical school will be for you.
And then I also want to show you with two prominent and extremely thoughtful and intelligent people have said about dyslexia, and they are dyslexic. The first one is David Boies, the attorney, and the second one is Charles Schwab, the financier. So here's David.